All right, everyone, please come forward, take your seats. We have plenty of very excellent seats here in the front for all of our Baptist friends back there. We've got plenty of great seats. You don't even have to come all the way to the front. There's plenty in the middle here too. But we're really excited to kick off our last general session here today at the Georgia Dairy Conference. We've got a great speaker here, Dr. Kee Jim, someone with a wealth of knowledge and experience in feeding cattle. He's got many different cattle feeding operations across Canada and the US, and we're very excited to have him here and present on the business side of beef on dairy. Dr. Jim, thank you for coming to the Georgia Dairy Conference.
Thank you. All right, well, we'll get started here. This talk could take a number of different directions. I have slides, but I don't always necessarily very good at sticking with them, but we'll try to do the best we can here and talk about the business of beef on dairy. I just need to get the slides to advance. Interesting. Oh, there we go backwards now. All right. Okay, so I've got really 10 things that I want to talk about. And I think, many of you in your room may know some of the background on, how the beef on dairy thing really got going. But I think it's worth looking at that, because I think it tells us a little bit about where we're going to end up here in the future. So a lot of times you need to look a little bit at the past to figure out what direction that this thing is headed. Also want to talk a little bit about what the cattle inventory situation is for beef cattle in North America, because that's really what's driving these phenomenal pricing structure that you're seeing for day olds. And then a little bit of an idea on how big can it get in terms of the overall beef supply in North America. A little bit on calf value, some of the additional benefits that B-on-D cattle have from a consumer perspective, and a little bit of value chain alignment, and then a little bit about where this thing could potentially get to in the future. So whenever I go to give a talk, particularly to dairy farmers, my background is not in dairy. It's actually in beef cattle production. I grew up on a ranch in the interior of BC, pretty remote spot. It was basically 100 miles from anywhere, right? Small town of about 50 people. And my dad was a hardcore rancher who fit the mold pretty well. When I went to start a university and taking courses in animal science and various things and learning how to balance rations, which is a pretty important thing for you guys in the dairy world. So I come home all excited about, okay, here's what we got to do. We got to analyze our hay. We got to do this. We got to add minerals, and this is all going to work out pretty good. And he said, well, here's how it really works. He says, what I do is I count the number of cows. I count the number of bales. I figure out how many days I'm going to feed, and I'm going to just divide. So if I have to send you off to university to figure that out, I think I'm wasting my time here, right? So that was a little bit of the background. And then the other interesting story I had is he said, I'm sending you off to all this school stuff, he says, but he says, I don't know. He says, I still think you're young and you're stupid. He says, but don't worry, one of those things will change with time. So here I am today, talking to dairy farmers. So my involvement in the beef on dairy thing goes back to when we first started in 2011. And it was really a project in the Jersey world, to try to figure out a way of adding value to something that for most of the time, the purebred Jersey calf would have zero value, in fact, a negative value at times when corn prices are high. So was interested in the project back then. And we also were heavily involved as Holstein feeders, both in Canada and the US, right? So we were familiar with, some of the things that of calf ranches, and we essentially we weren't involved in raising them, but we bought calves at about 325 pounds from calf ranches across Canada and the US and put them in our feedlots. So that's where my involvement first started. I thought I would just put up this slide to review a little bit on the fed beef side of the equation. And I think that, people are probably familiar with, seed stock, commercial cow-calf, backgrounders, stockers, feedlot, sort of the beef side of it. But I think what a lot of people forget is that on the commercial dairy side, roughly 17 to 22%, depending on the year, of fed cattle actually come from what used to be the Holstein side, right? So it's always been a significant part of the beef, of the overall fed cattle beef supply. So when you go out to a supermarket and you randomly buy a steak, it's a 1 in 5 chance that that animal originated from a dairy, right? So it's not just the cow going into hamburger that contributes to the beef supply chain. And so a lot of people are, don't remember that, but that's a pretty important thing. Like I said, oh, I've got a typo here. Holstein steers, 17 to 22% of fed beef production, and historically about 4.5 million steers slaughtered annually in the U.S. And so always have been a pretty important part of the system. And basically they sold at a discount to the native beef cattle because of the lower red meat yield coming from a Holstein, right? So there was always a basis associated with the Holstein steer. Packers paid less for them because when they hung them up, they had a lower dressing percentage and a lower cutout, right? So that sort of made sense. And then all of the major packers were involved in the Holstein slaughter, and it was a business that was, very well defined, starting in California in the 1960s and 70s. So that was around for a long time. So then what happened, right? Because again, the fact that you would crossbreed a dairy animal and have an improved animal from the viewpoint of beef cattle feedlot production, not a new idea, right? Talked about data available even from the 60s on it. But it didn't happen because we didn't have sex semen with fertility similar to conventional semen. And overall, the reproductive metrics and the emergence of the genomics, things like that, have made it so that you can have 40, maybe I get a range of numbers, but people say 35 to 55% of my cows I could breed to a beef animal and still have enough high quality replacement heifers for a steady state situation, right? So then you've got those background factors, and then also you have the jerseys as a meaningful percentage of the overall cow numbers. Again, depending on whose numbers you look at, between 1.2 and 1.4 and 5 million Jersey cows, right? Again, whose net value as a purebred is 0 from a feeding perspective. And then we had this rather major collapse in the value of the day-old Holsteins. So what happened there? We had one major meat packer decided that they weren't interested in slaughtering the fed Holsteins anymore. And they said, maybe we'll give you 6 to 12 months here and the party's over. It turned out to be less time than that, right? And they would say, well, we want, better marbling cattle. Our main customer, Walmart, doesn't want anything with dairy influence. And besides, they have too many liver abscesses, they're too tall, blah, blah, blah. End of day, pretty major collapse in the selling price of the Holstein steer, right? Which we kind of notice when it gets up to the $25 hundredweight level. That'll get your attention when you're selling fat cattle in a pretty big hurry. So pretty big implosion in the situation. And if you recall, the Holstein day-olds, peaked. This is the California day-old price, 15, 16. They were up there over $500, and then a pretty major decline in the pricing. Somewhere along the line in Idaho there, we bought calves, FOB farms for $20, right? So caused a pretty ugly pretty ugly change in the whole situation. And then the other factors that have, accelerated the whole thing is really the big change in inventory of beef calves, right? The North American beef cow herd, both in Canada and the US, is shrinking. And the size of the dairy herd has been remarkably steady, right, between 9.2 and 9.8 million cows. We've got the number of beef and dairy operations are declining, but the remaining are increasing. And you're going to see, consolidation moving forward. Record high prices for feeder cattle and day-old calves. Right? If you look at the inventory here, numbers here, we're getting to levels in the US that we haven't seen since the 60s, right? So pretty massive decline in the number of cattle. This has been driven by a couple of factors. One of the real big factors is rotating drought across all the major cattle-producing cow-calf areas across the US and Canada. So droughts played a big role in this. Historical lack of profitability in the cow-calf sector has played a role in the equation. And also because of improvements in productivity, size of animals, we actually need fewer cows to sustain the same amount of beef output. So same situation that we have here in Canada, we're printing a low of beef cattle under 3.6 million cows, a number we haven't seen since the 1990s. So what you're getting here, and as I mentioned before, this is the scale here is less than 400,000 heads. So you got 9.2 to just under 9.4, pretty steady state for the number of cows on the dairy side. If we look at farms, you can see here that in the US on beef cows at one time close to 900,000 farms, and in 2002 just over 600,000 farms. So pretty big decline. Same story in Canada, 20-year period going from 67,000 farms to 54,000. Pretty big drops. As a result, commencing in about 20, you have this unprecedented rise over a period of 4 years. We've got the levels that we haven't seen since the peak in 15, and we're going higher, right? So pretty unbelievable to think that we would see feeder cattle prices both in Canada and the US that high. And the other interesting thing is that I didn't think I would live long enough to see $2 fat cattle, right? And we got here about a month or so ago, right? So I felt that, it would happen at some point, but I thought that might be not necessarily before my expiration date, right? So when I first started in the business 45 years ago, cattle were trading for 53 cents, right? So that's quite a rise in overall pricing. All right, so if we look at and agree that the steady state number for herd maintenance is it could be done with 40%. My math would say that there's potential for about 3.7 million B-on-D cattle. People say, well, how many were there last year? We don't know for sure, but when I talk to Cattle Facts and some of the stuff they do, they would say, could have been as high as 3 million were produced in the US last year. Of course, nobody would be able to track that number for sure. So we can see that this thing has become a pretty significant change in the economics at the dairy farm gate. I think going from $20 to $900 or higher is pretty relevant, right? So it goes from being money for buying lunch, right, to money that you can actually buy something with, right? So obviously it's got everybody's attention in terms of a program. So what makes the B-on-D calf more valuable? in a word, you would say it's because you're capturing the effect of crossbreeding. So you have significant improvements in the gain of the cattle at the feedlot, significant improvement in feed conversion, improved quality grade and yield grade, improved cuttability, and improved in the shape of the primal cuts. With the Holsteins, one of the a lot of the food service people didn't like the shape of the strip and the ribeye, or they thought they were like too small and too narrow, right? So that problem goes away with crossbreeding. And at least theoretically, we should have improved outcomes with the effect of heterosis. Not always clear in the data sets that we look at, but it's not easy to look at population-based statistics on something on breed differences, right? Because your animal health outcomes are confounded by geography, location, weather, management, and a number of other factors. Some additional benefits of the B-on-D versus native beef cattle from the consumer perspective. On average, you're going to have a superior eating experience because these are youthful cattle when slaughtered. The production system is such that they're in a calf ranch for 150 and 160 days, then on feed a little over a year. They've been on a high energy dense diet for a very long period of time. And the biggest correlation between tenderness and the carcass relates to the age. People get hung up on marbling, right? They say, oh, it's all driven by marbling. That's not true. It's actually driven by age. It's quite a bit more important than marbling itself, right? So by definition, these cattle as a subset of cattle are very good at eating experience. The other thing that's important, it hasn't been necessarily monetized by any group, but we are working on it. It's the lowest carbon footprint of any grain-fed beef production out there, at least 50% lower than your traditional native beef cattle system. A couple of reasons. One is the cattle never see grass, right? So they're never on grass. And the majority of the carbon associated with the cow stays with the feedlot, right? So if you only take the portion responsible for producing the calf, move that with the calf, the carbon with the cow stays at the dairy, and that animal never sees grass, and you harvest it that quickly, you have a significant reduction in carbon footprint. So that's a little bit of a background on how we got to where we are today. Just want to talk a little bit about the system and how some of the things have emerged. So you've got the stakeholders of the dairy, the people providing the genetics, calf ranches, cattle feeders, and then downstream, of course, you have the packer, and then beyond the packer, you have restaurants, traders, and then ultimately the consumer in this equation. So obviously, there's been a significant increase in the value of the day-old calf. In many situations, the BOD calf is probably, depending on exact breeding and so on, $300 a head more valuable than the purebred Holstein steer. So that's pretty good. Of course, the things that would concern the dairy would be things like conception, cavities, gestation length, and number of stillbirths when you're evaluating which potential beef sires to use. So all of those concerns, right, are not really part of the value proposition for the subsequent steps, but they would be important to make those things right for the dairy. So what's pretty interesting is, if you look at the progress that's been made on the dairy side of the equation over the last, pick a time frame, 20, 30, 40 years, in North America, it's been pretty remarkable, right? What's occurred in all metrics of production in dairy cattle. And the reason why that's occurred, right, is because of the availability of phenotypic data pretty much universally, right? So the dairy producers have provided data so that the genetic companies can build better bulls. But if you look at the situation with the beef cattle, basically beef semen is kind of an interesting sideline historically for the semen companies, right? Less than 2 million doses in the aggregate. Not very many beef producers are involved in AI programs for, for a host of different reasons. But this whole deal with Beyond D changes that game significantly, right? Because the total addressable market, or the size of it, goes up to at least 12 million doses, right? I mean, it's a 6-fold to 7-fold increase in the number of doses that can be sold. So suddenly, right, the genetics providers have a real reason to try to produce, better bulls for the Beyond D sector. There's enough market there to catch their attention, right? So it's been a real potential growth area for a lot of the semen companies, something that was a pretty static, fairly inconsequential, mainly a seed stock orientated deal prior to the Beyond D. And of course, for the calf ranches, they will benefit from improvements in gain, conversion, and health in these cattle. And they're really focused on any feedlot operation, calf ranch operation. It only works if you're full, right? And that's what's driving this market, is because there is a deficit of feeder cattle available relative to the total amount of space available at calf ranches and feedlots, right? So people are scrambling for inventory, and they're looking at any form of inventory that will go into the pens. So the dairy producers have been direct beneficiaries of this need for feeder cattle as we went through the dramatic reduction that's occurred in the beef cattle herd. So at the packer level, there will be less liver abscesses in the crossbred cattle, simply because they gain faster and there'll be less days on planet, right? Less time to develop the problems. The liver abscess issue is not a function of the fact that they're dairy cattle. It's a function of the feeding system. So if you would take a beef calf and you would wean it at birth and put it in a calf ranch and do the same things we do to these cattle, you're going to have the same outcome. In fact, we know that because we have purebred cattle or beef in dairy embryos that we've utilized. And when you do that, not surprisingly, you have the same outcomes. So there'll be other interventions and products and management systems that will be developed to mitigate the level of liver abscesses. And some of those are already starting to have an effect. But there's no way that cattle fed that way are going to have we'll never get to the levels of native beef cattle that go to grass and are put on feed at an older age. That's not going to happen, but it can be managed with interventions to get to a level that it doesn't cause the packer concerns. Carcass cutability on these crosses is now very similar to the native beef cattle, and because there's been so much emphasis put on marbling by the native cattle, they are getting, with the crossbreeding, better quality grade and yield grade, and so it's right up there. As mentioned before, the shape of the primal issue has gone away, and the lower carbon footprint story has yet to be told or to be monetized by the packer. Now, the huge advantage to the beef on dairy system is that all the data can be linked. right? You can link the sire and the dam information to the calf, and it can be tracked throughout all phases of production, through the calf ranch, through the feedlot, and into the plant. This is not really achievable at scale in the beef cattle world, right? I've spent 45 years in the feedlot business, and in that time frame, on an annualized basis, we probably have 50, 60,000 head where we can link up all the data, right? It's just very difficult to get the attention of a cow-calf producer long enough to be in a, in a long-term program where where you buy the calves every year and you have continuity of your data and your information, right? It's just very, very difficult. And remember, most of them do not use AI. You're in multiple sire mating systems, right? So if you want to take it to sire, you can do it today for about $10 a head, right? On the via the genotypic approach, right? But again, pretty tough to do, fairly simple to do in the beef on dairy systems. So really, it's the first opportunity we've had to achieve the full alignment at scale, right? We just really haven't had that opportunity in the past. People have certainly talked about it, but it's been a small percentage of the cattle in the overall system that that qualify, right? In our systems, we're going to turn about 850,000 fat cattle a year. 50,000 really is an interesting sideline, but it's not a core business, right? It's just not enough volume that way. Whereas you can do that here on the beef on dairy side or on the dairy side. But if we look at how this thing has transpired, because really for the last 4 or 5 years where this thing has taken off, it's been in the biggest bull market in the history of the cattle business. So every day you wake up and guess what? Your day-old calf is usually worth more money, right? So pretty hard to establish programs in that environment, right? Because what is your incentive to be hooked, to a program, when it seems like everybody in the world wants my calf? So if I don't sell them to you, I'll just sell them to the next guy, right? And everyone carries on. And as a result, right, it's been a little bit more work than it should have to be able to get a meaningful number of cattle aligned in a chain. I think this year we'll probably get to about 300,000 head of cattle that we have all the data and all the information on. And so what we're focused on is trying to make a meaningful improvement in conversion of cattle, in feed conversion. So we've been able to improve gain, and we've been able to improve carcass, because those are easy traits to measure. Conversion, we haven't got anywhere with in the 40 years I've been involved in it, right? But in order to do that, you have to be able to take cattle, feed them in groups by sire, do a bunch of the testing and do all this kind of stuff, which we're just on the front end of to be able to change that. But in this type of market, say the whole alignment possibility is there, but it's not really occurring to the extent that it probably should, right? Because if you think about our competitive position with the other proteins, what is our issue? Well, it takes a year to, you've got gestation length, right? That's an issue. We've got way lower capital costs per unit of output in swine production and poultry production. And most of this occurs in where the environment is controlled, right? So you don't have the geographic barriers. But in order to really compete longer term, we do have to get more efficient at what we're doing. We have to improve our productivity somehow, right? And we really haven't done a very good job of that. And the reason why is because We don't have the information, we don't have the data on a meaningful number of population in order to achieve that. Because the phenotypic data, unlike the dairy, is not readily accessible by everyone, right? The phenotypic data, you lose it at the calf ranch, you can lose it at the feedlot, you can lose it at the packing plant, right? And your database just blows it, blows apart. So although this is possible to have, de facto vertical integration, and you would theoretically be able to develop some pretty interesting ways of getting the value proposition and getting things conveyed back to the dairy, but it's going to be difficult to get that occurring at scale. So what our approach is, and what we've done in our group, is that we've bought calf ranches so that we can work with our own people on keeping that data integrity. We have our own feedlots, and we have relationships with all of the packers that allow us to harvest the data. And we have a joint venture with the URIS group to help us do the semen side and to evaluate the bulls and to have the breeding programs to produce the better bulls with time, right? So it's a closed loop type system, and it's it's the Feedwise Onyx program that we've been working with. But what's essential in the whole system is that we have to get the data on the calf, right? We have to be able to capture the data, maintain it throughout the entire system. And the tricky part in this environment with the calf price going up daily is how do you establish, the base price for the calf, right? That's proven to be the trickiest part of the whole thing. And there's been a lot of different ideas out there about how you're going to do that. You can tie it actuarially to the board, and you can have a formula. Here's the problem. Anyone that elected to do a formula price at any point in time in the last 4 years hasn't come out on the winning side, because the price has gone up every day, right? So when a person makes a decision to do a formula price for a year and they doesn't work out, they go, well, that's a stupid idea. That's not the right thing to be doing. Well, it's not necessarily true. It may have been the wrong thing economically at that point in time, but it doesn't mean it's going to be the wrong answer forever, right? That really doesn't mean that at all, right? And so I've been around this thing long enough to have seen 4 major catastrophes on the cattle feeding side, and I will live long enough to see the next one, right? So that I can assure you. So what happens in a bull market is everyone thinks that this can never end, right? It's just as, it's all good forever. And I have no idea when it switches. It'd be like trying to predict the price of milk, right? I think you guys have probably been in business long enough to know that's pretty tough to do, pretty tough to predict the price of fat cattle, because it's not just about supply. Everyone's looking at this saying, oh, they can't build the supply fast enough. Cattlefax is telling us they haven't started to rebuild the herd yet, right? So how can the price go down? Forget about supply. What about demand, right? You change the demand side, it's equally as dramatic, right? We've been around long enough to know that on the volatility side, politically and otherwise, there's been enough. You're only ever supposed to see one black swan in your life, but I've seen a flock of them over the years, right? To know that you just don't know. So you can have a demand event, you can have a black swan event, and also corn can go up, right? It can, right? And it will at some point. I don't know when. But remember that for every $1 a bushel change in the price of corn, you're looking about $150 change in the price of a day old. Right? So we're at the lower end of corn prices here right now for historical purposes, right? Corn will go to $8 again one day, and it will go back to $4 at some point as well. But my point is that there's, a lot of factors out there that make it impossible to predict, right? What exactly is going to happen here. But for those that have stayed in the cash and have stayed day to day on their pricing of the day olds, been the right answer, right? But we'll see as we, as we go forward, what will happen. The other thing that helps us in our system to balance the risk as well is that we're not sellers of feeder cattle. We should have been for the last 3 years, right? We'd have done better selling 450 weight feeders than we would by finishing them out. But our program is to own them from birth, first breath to last breath. And that's a little bit of your hedge along the way, right? Because that's our entire system. So when the next downturn comes, the biggest bite is for the people selling the feeder cattle. It adjusts very rapidly, very quickly, and it's very, very ugly on the front end, right? So those that have got into the feeder cattle business, because it's, hey, that's capitalism. It's been the right business to be in. Selling your day old's been good. Selling the feeder has probably, in most cases, it would be better of selling the 450 weight, right? So that's all worked out pretty well. And so what do people do when they are profitable? They expand. So they buy more calves. And what happens, the problem with that is when the wreck occurs, you will have peak inventory. You'll have more inventory to lose money on than you ever made it on, right? Than how you got there, right? So your demise when that happens is somewhat abrupt, right? It's like it's like that cartoon. It says, well, how did you go broke? And the guy says, well, slowly at first, then suddenly. Right? Because that's what, I've seen this movie a few times, right? So, right, I know exactly what happens here, right? And this is not the time, if you're involved on the cattle feeding side, to be significantly expanding your inventory, right? It's the wrong part of the cycle. But because the guys trading feeder cattle have been so profitable, right? They're keen for more, right? They're looking for, they can't get enough of what's happening here right now, right? They want more of it, and they're going to get more of it, right? Because I'm going to give them more of mine, right? I say this is the worst timing possible for increasing your inventory. So I've talked a little bit about what I think the future is for what's going to happen on the day old side, on the feedlot side. In the feedlot game, we had a very good last couple of years. This year will be so-so, but we're going to have some pretty ugly years here down the road as we compete for fewer and fewer feeder cattle, right? And then the other guys that are going to have a hard time, and they've had a hard time this year, and it gets harder, is the packing plant. Right now, as much as I don't want to send them too many sympathy cards, they are our customer. So the day comes when what happens, right? They go, oh, I'm tired of this, right? Losing money like this. What are we going to do? Well, I tell you what we do. We shut plants, right? And the day that occurs is when it's really bad for us, right? Because you have not even less space to sell, to sell the cattle too. Right. So that's what, the long-term cattle cycle is one of, it's a question of whether the packer starts to bleed before the feedlot. And I think in this case, the packer's bleeding first. Our bleeding is about to come, and we'll all be hemorrhaging together here at some point. Right. And when that happens, that has a pretty devastating impact on the day old price. Now, when is that going to happen? It's like trying to forecast the milk price or whatever. Wouldn't have any idea more than you do as to what the exact timing is, but does it happen? 100%. All right, so what are we looking for? Well, what we're trying to do is incrementally improve all of these things over time that will give us, we'll get a genetic effect, that we will have a genetic delta between ourselves and our competitors with the cattle that we're producing. And we are intensely focused on feed conversion, because that's the biggest area for improvement out there, because it's the one that has not been selected for very well, if at all. So that's what our programs are focused on. We're also working on either the packer, the restaurateurs, the wholesalers to try to convince them of the increased value that these cattle should have to them because of the attributes that they have, right? And I also believe that long term, with the people in the dairies that we work with, we will be able to put quite a delta in value between ourselves and our competitors if we keep focusing on the genetics, right? Because that has occurred in every other species, whether it's poultry, pork, your business of dairy farming, the genetics have ultimately made a huge difference, right? But the difference here is that the information is not universally available to do this, right? So arguably any of the improvements in genetics that occur, similar genetics or close to it are available across the industry. I know it's not quite that simple, but within a realm that, that is true, right? So for us though, we're putting the investment in because we know how hard it is to align the data and actually get all of this stuff so that you can make genetic improvement, but we don't plan on selling semen, right? That's what we plan on doing, is providing semen to our cooperators to produce these animals and keep the genetic delta, right? So we're trying to create that spread, right? Because the information is not universally available, right? So that's the fundamental difference between, I mean, if you look at it, really the pigs did that with the grandparent stock, right? The genetic companies, they didn't really sell the genetics. You had to license it and you had to work, that type of program to, to make it happen. So that's where, that's where we think it's headed. Again, there's a lot of different, like any good capitalist system, there's a lot of different thoughts. People are saying, well, the hell difference does it make as long as I produce a black calf? I can seemingly line up people to buy them, right? And yeah, today that's largely true, right? Whether that's true tomorrow, I'm not entirely sure. But that premise is based on, and many of my cattle feeder competitors say, oh, why are you getting yourself so bent out of shape about this? Just go buy the bloody feeders and be done with it, right? That's what we're going to do. And I said, well, that's what we've done, in the native cattle world for a long time. And we think we know how well that's worked, because the difference here is that if we can produce something that's genetically better, everybody isn't going to have it, right? So their premise is you got 4 or 5 genetic companies, everyone's trying to do the same thing. At the end of the day, everyone's going to come out with bulls that are pretty similar. Not sure that's true, right? So we're about to find out, right? And we'll see if we can get the genetic spread in what we're doing to what we think we can get basis, the genomics and the science. But in how I look at it is, even if we're incorrect, we're still on the right general pathway. It would just take us a while to get it. Might take us longer to get it figured out than we anticipated. And you're hampered by the 1 calf a year thing. And by the fact that cows you start breeding today, you don't get your report card for 26 months, right? It's, it's a long wait. And that pretty much exceeds the attention span of most cattle feeders, right? That's just too long a time, right? That's it to get. So the lag of data and information here is pretty tough, right? It's a slow process, but once you get started, then it tends to be, accumulative, from there. So that's a little bit on the journey that we've been on here. And it's been, quite fascinating for me, because I know virtually, and probably that's true today, virtually nothing about the dairy business, but I think I've learned a bit over the last 10 years. And it's been a lot of fun to travel across the US and visit producers from all avenues and different sizes and production systems, and how they adapt their cows to the environment and the geography and the feeding systems, and pretty fascinating stuff. So it's been a lot of fun, and look forward to to continuing visiting with you. I'll be around most of today. Well, actually all of today, because no one's leaving Savannah tonight. You're stuck. So good. I'll close there. And if there are any time for any questions, we can shoot.
Yeah, do we have any questions? Yep, right there.
Yeah, it's a good question. So in my naivety, when I started this, I said, well, this makes no sense. Like, why am I paying the same price for a day-old heifer as a steer? Because there's a difference in value, you know, pick a number, but it's at least $150 difference in production cost, right? The heifer converts poorer, gains slower, slightly better carcass value, but you can't get them as big. So you're losing $100. And right now it's a big feeding margin. Cost of gains 110, selling price is $2. That difference, that 90 cents is a pretty big deal. It's $90 a head in revenue, right? So the heifer's at a pretty severe disadvantage. She always is at a disadvantage. Right now she's at a big disadvantage. So I thought, well, that doesn't make any sense. I'm just going to put a spread on. Well, that was my first lesson, right? They're going, well, that's good. Then we're just not going to sell you any calves, right? So I thought, okay. Well, and to this day, we're still buying day olds priced the same. But what you're getting me to do is really it's imputed into the value of the steer. So you're getting less than you should for the steer and more than you should for the heifer, right? But there should be a difference between heifer and steer pricing. And I think what you're leading to is what about sex, you know, semen for producing 90% steers? If I would do it today at $17 sexed, I can pay for the semen price differential and come out at roughly break even. But I think the disadvantage, the dairymen tell me we're still a few percent offside in conception on sexed male semen. So that day will come, right, when the two get close enough, right? And I think you'll see a lot of that, because if I could deal with 90% steers in a management system at even money, I'd be better off, right? So I think within a few years, as that technology develops, I think you will see the majority of the Beyond D is sex semen. Just got to get now my understanding from talking to the various semen companies is that they have some bulls that actually reverse sort pretty well, right? That they have achieved, you know, rates that are totally acceptable, just not on a big percentage of the bulls that they have available. Sorry, does that answer your question? I think, okay.
Yep. We got time for one quick one.
Dr. Jim, we're seeing this increased incidence of congestive heart failure, particularly in the English cattle. Do you see any benefit to these beef on dairy calves in that regard? Expect any different outcomes with them?
Yeah, the question was around the incidence of congestive heart failure in feedlot cattle. And so it's talked about a lot because it's kind of dramatic when you have fat steers dropping dead, right? But it's the actual incidence of it against the entire population is only about 0.2%. Right. And interestingly enough, if we go back, we have pretty good records going back about 35 years. It was about 0.1 before. So yeah, it has nominally increased. What's alarming about it at times, it occurs in clusters, right? So on a population basis, not a big deal, but if you happen to own the cattle in that pen, right, then it can become a big deal. So obviously it has a strong genetic component to it, right? And it's been linked with more with the Angus cattle than others, but I can assure you it occurs in other breeds as well, because the problem is Angus have become the dominant breed. Most of the cattle in the feedlot are black. So then people say, oh, right, well, this is an Angus problem. Well, yeah, if all your cattle are Angus to begin with, then it will appear that it is, right? But it may not exactly be, you know, be that simple. The Beyond D thing, we don't really see much difference. But again, these such small numbers on a population basis, really hard to tell, right? Whether, you know, it is, but I would say certainly no worse, but we do see these little clusters of it. And unfortunately, those occurred before we got our complete linkage in most of our data. So when we had it, we couldn't trace it back, right? Because those were calves that we'd just bought, you know, through regular channels that didn't have them checked. So unfortunately, the 3 or 4 times we've had it, we haven't been able to trace it to a specific bull. We could today, right? But we haven't had a cluster here for about a year.
Thank you, Dr. Jim. And like you said, he'll be around if you've got any
Yep.
other questions on the side or in the back of the room. He's right. You're stuck with us for the night, most likely. But one more round of applause for Dr. Kee Jim.